Julia Morgan, now 27, lives in a modest yet warm apartment in the small town of Fairhaven, Vermont, where cobblestone sidewalks and colonial-style homes echo a slower pace of life. Each morning begins with the comforting ritual of making coffee in her tiny kitchen, the window overlooking the town's central square. From that very window, Julia often glances at the old building that once bore her family's name, Morgan Fine Arts Gallery, a place that used to symbolize prestige and success. But to Julia, it's simply a shadow of what once was. Now her world revolves around raising her 6-year-old son, Caleb, a bright, intuitive boy with a natural eye for color and emotion. Their walls are adorned with paintings, some Julia's, others Caleb's, each one a reflection of the life they've built together, filled with creativity, resilience, and quiet joy. Julia works as a children's art teacher at the local community center, a job she cherishes not for status or salary, but for the chance to ignite imagination in young minds. While her life lacks luxury, it is rich in purpose, and every moment shared with Caleb reminds her that despite the past, she is exactly where she is meant to be. When Julia turned 18, everything in her world collapsed with a single sentence: "You are no longer a Morgan." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't even emotional. It was cold, decisive, and final. That same evening, her parents, Charles and Vivienne Morgan, quietly closed her bedroom door and told her she had 24 hours to leave. She had just told them she was pregnant. No yelling, no desperate pleas, just rejection. She packed a small duffel bag with a few clothes, her sketchbook, and $17 in coins she found in her younger brother's drawer. The home she grew up in, filled with imported rugs, priceless artwork, and polite conversation, shut her out without a second thought. The shame of an unplanned pregnancy was too great a stain on the carefully curated image of the Morgan family. Her boyfriend Damien was the only person she thought would stand by her. A quiet, thoughtful boy from her art club. He once dreamed with her about opening a small gallery where art came from the heart, not appraisals. But when Julia called him that night, shaking and desperate, he hesitated. "I've been accepted to Parsons," he finally said. "I can't be a dad right now." And just like that, he was gone. That night, with no place to sleep, Julia sat on a park bench in the biting cold. She stared up at the stars, not looking for answers, just searching for the strength to breathe. By morning, she returned to school and tried to carry on, her world now completely unrecognizable. It was her high school art teacher, Miss Lorraine Foster, who first noticed something was wrong. Julia's eyes were red, her steps slow, and her spirit dimmed. Without hesitation, Miss Foster invited her into her home, a weathered cottage on the outskirts of town. It had creaky floors, hand-woven curtains, and the smell of fresh bread always lingering in the air. It wasn't grand, but it was safe. Miss Foster offered no pity, just space, support, and quiet understanding. Julia lived there for the remainder of her senior year, helping Miss Foster with chores and studying at night. She finished school, while carrying her unborn son, and preparing to face motherhood alone. There were whispers in the hallways, judgment from old friends, and silence from relatives. But Julia never stopped showing up, never missed a test, never turned in late work. She was no longer painting for praise. She painted to survive. With every brushstroke, she rebuilt herself from the inside out. When her son Caleb was born that summer, the hospital room was bare and the resources limited, but when she first heard his cry, Julia felt a power no rejection could ever take from her. She named him Caleb, meaning faithful, wholehearted, and made a vow to protect him from the conditional love that had torn her world apart. For the next few years, Julia worked tirelessly, part-time babysitting in the mornings, online art education classes in the evenings, and weekend shifts at a bakery downtown. Miss Foster continued to help however she could, watching Caleb so Julia could study or sleep. There were nights when Julia collapsed in bed still in her clothes, her hands stained with flour or watercolor, but she never complained. Every sleepless night, every aching muscle meant one more step forward. When Caleb turned 3, Julia finally earned her community teaching certification in art. She stood on Miss Foster's porch, certificate in hand, and cried, not because of what she had lost, but because of what she had gained: independence, resilience, and the strength to start again. Her life had been defined by exclusion, but she was now building something new. She became the art teacher at the Fairhaven Community Center, where kids painted not what they saw, but what they felt. Her classroom became a place of freedom, just like Miss Foster's home had once been for her. Julia had no family dinners, no birthday cards from her parents, but she had a son who looked at her with unwavering love, and for her that was more than enough. Every brushstroke Julia laid on canvas carried with it a piece of the silent pain she had once endured. The pain of being dismissed, discarded, and forgotten by the very people who were supposed to stand beside her. For years, she lived in quiet defiance, raising her son, Caleb, alone while building a modest life from the remnants of broken dreams. Yet, it wasn't bitterness that defined her path. It was resolve. The same resolve that led her to teach art to children at the Fairhaven Community Center, to keep painting even when no one was watching, and to raise Caleb with warmth, empathy, and patience she was never afforded. So, when her younger sister Grace called unexpectedly after years of no contact, inviting her to a wedding and hinting that their parents had changed, Julia didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Her first instinct was to protect her peace, but then Caleb asked her a question that haunted her. "Do I have grandparents?" In that moment, Julia realized this wasn't just about her. It was about giving her son the option to decide for himself. The wedding was elegant, held at a sprawling countryside venue draped in white lilies and gold accents, with champagne flutes lined up under crystal chandeliers. Julia walked in holding Caleb's hand, her heart pounding not with fear, but with the weight of past wounds. Eyes turned. Whispers floated. The prodigal daughter, the one disowned at 18, had returned, not in shame, but in quiet confidence. Caleb, wearing a tiny navy blue suit, clung to his mother's side, curious but unfazed. He didn't know these people, nor did he recognize the layers of judgment hiding behind their polished smiles. Grace met her at the entrance, tears welling up in her eyes. "You came," she whispered, pulling Julia into a tight hug. Julia smiled faintly, more out of politeness than warmth. "I came for Caleb." She was led to a private table near the window, apart from the core family circle, but it didn't matter. Caleb pulled out his sketchbook and began drawing as if nothing else in the room existed. That was his magic. His ability to shut out the noise and create beauty from within. Later, during the reception, a tall man approached their table. He introduced himself as Thomas Hale, a local art columnist who had noticed one of Caleb's sketches. "Did your son draw this?" he asked, pointing to a scene Caleb had quietly rendered: a mother and child walking under the moonlight, surrounded by towering trees. Julia nodded, surprised. "That level of emotion and composition at his age," Mr. Hale said, "is extraordinary." His words traveled through the room like wind through dry leaves. Guests turned, and murmurs rose. Julia's father, sitting across the hall, suddenly looked up. Her mother, once poised and unreadable, now appeared visibly shaken. Someone muttered, "That's Diana Morgan's grandson, isn't it?" The air grew thick. For a moment Julia considered leaving, but then her father stood up and walked across the room, stopping in front of her. He looked smaller somehow, his posture less rigid, his eyes clouded with something she hadn't seen in years: remorse. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "Not just about your art, about everything, and I'd like to try to make it right." Julia held Caleb's hand a little tighter. "I don't want words," she said. "I want actions." Her mother soon followed, reaching for Caleb with trembling hands. "May I sit with him?" she asked. Julia hesitated, but nodded. Caleb looked up, then gently passed her a crayon. That was his version of an invitation. From that day on, Things didn't become perfect, but they began. Her father started attending her Saturday classes. Her mother, once distant and controlling, started baking apple tarts for Caleb and reading him bedtime stories on weekends. Julia didn't forget what had happened, but she allowed herself to believe that healing could begin. Not for the sake of the past, but for the sake of the child who sat at the heart of her world, painting love in every shade. When Julia's estranged parents first contacted her after nearly 6 years of silence, they didn't come with apologies, they came with a check. Enclosed in a plain envelope, with her father's name scrawled in familiar slanted handwriting, was a trust fund payment she was once promised, but never expected to see. The letter that came with it was short and filled with formal restraint. If you're willing, I'd like to see you again. Not to justify anything, only to listen. Julia sat in her small apartment, the check in one hand, her son Caleb's crayon sketch in the other, unsure which felt more real. The money couldn't erase the freezing nights, the unpaid bills, or the years spent raising a child alone. But it wasn't the check that made her pause. It was the letter. The first time her father had ever addressed her by name, since the night he told her she was no longer his daughter. That moment pushed her toward a crossroads. Forgiveness wasn't something she was ready to hand out like charity. But when Caleb looked up at her and asked, "Mommy, do I have grandparents?" she realized this decision wasn't just hers to make. She had protected Caleb from the chaos of her past, but maybe now she owed him the chance to see what family could look like, if it was done right. Julia agreed to attend her younger sister Grace's wedding, where her parents would also be present. The invitation arrived printed on heavy cardstock, trimmed in silver and wrapped in a ribbon her mother would have chosen. The note inside was handwritten in her mother's delicate script. "No words can change the past, but I hope you'll give the present a chance." For the first time, Julia felt a door creaking open, not wide but enough to peek through. At the wedding, the tension was thick as fog. Julia's arrival with Caleb turned heads. Whispered, unsure whether to express sympathy or stay quiet. Her parents were at the head table. Grace, surrounded by admiration and soft music. But the moment Julia walked in, the room shifted. She wasn't the rebellious girl who had been cast out anymore. She was a mother, an artist, and a woman who had built a life from the ruins of rejection, and she didn't walk in asking for a place. She created one. Later that night, her father approached her during the reception, his voice uncertain but stripped of pride. "You don't have to forgive us today, but I'm here to start showing you that I mean it." Julia didn't offer easy words. She simply said, "Come to Caleb's art class next Saturday. If you want to try, start there." And he did. With sketchbooks in hand, he showed up, sat quietly among the children and watched his grandson paint. It wasn't a grand gesture, it was consistency. And in that, Julia began to see something more honest than any apology effort. Her mother, too, found her own way back into Caleb's world, not with speeches, but with Saturday apple pie and fairy tales made up on the spot. She didn't try to fix everything. She just listened. Over time, their presence became routine, not disruptive, not performative. It was in the small things, staying past class to clean up brushes, mailing Julia a photo of her first painting they had saved without telling her, writing Caleb a birthday card in her own words, not borrowed ones. Julia knew none of this undid the pain, but something inside her had shifted. She didn't feel like the forgotten daughter anymore. She felt like someone being seen, slowly, cautiously, but with intention. And as winter settled over their small town, Julia found herself no longer dreading the holidays. She and Caleb decorated their tiny apartment, baked cookies, and for the first time in years, wrote 2 extra names on their gift tags, Grandpa and Grandma. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. As Julia began to rebuild the fragile bridge between her and her parents, she couldn't have predicted that another ghost from the past would come knocking. It happened on a quiet Saturday afternoon at the town gallery, where she and her students were preparing for the second children's exhibit. The scent of watercolor paper, soft chatter, and the joy of creation filled the space. Chloe had just rushed in to tell her someone unexpected was waiting in the lobby. When Julia stepped out, her heart dropped. Standing there polished and composed was David, Caleb's biological father. The man who vanished 6 years earlier. He greeted her with a soft smile that didn't reach his eyes. I saw the article in the paper, saw the exhibit. Then I saw the photo of Caleb. He held up a local magazine with their photo on the cover. He's my son Julia. I want to make it right. But Julia had heard those words before. Empty phrases used to soothe guilt, not build accountability. She remembered every night spent alone, every diaper change, every fever, and every bill she paid by painting late into the night. Make it right, she repeated, her voice low and steady. After 6 years of silence, no support, no calls, not a word when I needed you most. David's excuses began, full of I was young, and I didn't know what to do. But Julia saw through them. This wasn't about Caleb. It was about David's ego. About attaching himself to the image of a successful single mother and gifted child. You gave up your rights the moment you disappeared, she said firmly. If you don't leave now, my attorney will contact you. And just as she said it, her father Richard stepped out from the gallery doors, standing quietly beside her. I'm Richard Whitmore, he said calmly. And I prepared for this day years ago. If you take one step further, I'll release every legal document we've kept on file, including your abandonment record, to the press. David hesitated, realizing the Whitmore family now stood united, not in name alone, but in resolve. He left without another word, his polished shoes echoing through the corridor. Julia didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply breathed, a deep, clean breath. She had defended her son with the strength she had spent years building. And this time, the family that once turned away had her back. That night, Caleb asked, Mommy, who was that man? Julia gently replied, just someone from Mommy's past, someone who's not important anymore. Caleb thought for a moment, then said, but I still have you, and Grandma and Grandpa, and Aunt Chloe. Right. Julia smiled, brushing her hand through his hair. Yes, and that's all that matters. In the weeks that followed, the Whitmores became more than guests in Julia's life. Her father began visiting Caleb's class regularly, not to teach, but to quietly assist, helping mix colors, cleaning brushes, and learning from the children. Her mother Amelia found her way in through storytelling and homemade pie, creating a connection with Caleb that was warm and honest. There were no big speeches or promises, just actions. Small, steady, meaningful. It wasn't about replacing the years that were lost. It was about ensuring the years ahead were different. Caleb thrived in the warmth of family, and Julia, for the first time, began to trust that they were here not just to show up, but to stay. She had built a life without them, but now, with them gently returning, she saw the possibility of something even more valuable, a family that had finally learned how to love without conditions. And while David remained a shadow of a closed chapter, Julia stood tall in the light of the one she had rewritten herself on her own terms, with courage, clarity, and unwavering protection of the boy who gave her purpose. As winter settled over the quiet town of Fairbrook, Julia found herself reflecting more than ever on how far she had come. Her life, once upended by rejection and solitude, had begun to find rhythm and purpose. The painful past no longer dictated her every step, but it lingered like a scar, faded but never forgotten. Still, it was the small victories that carried her forward. Her art class at the local children's center thrived. Caleb, now a bright and expressive 6-year-old, had blossomed under the warmth of consistency and love. And perhaps most surprising of all, her once estranged parents were beginning to show up in the ways she had always needed. Her father, Richard, had become a regular presence in her classroom, often sitting quietly with the children, mixing paints or sharing simple brush techniques he remembered from his own youth. He never brought up the past, never apologized in flowery speeches, but through his presence, His willingness to be there without fanfare, Julia saw that he was trying to make amends in the only way he knew how. He was no longer the man obsessed with prestige or paralyzed by reputation. He was simply a grandfather learning how to be present. Amelia, Julia's mother, had found her own quiet path to reconnection. Each Wednesday afternoon, she took Caleb to the park with a picnic basket and an array of coloring books. She brought his favorite snacks, read him whimsical stories, and listened intently to his rambling tales about art, bugs, and school. What surprised Julia most wasn't the warmth in her mother's interactions, but the gentleness she had never witnessed growing up. It was as though Amelia had finally taken off the armor she once wore to protect the family image, and was simply learning how to love. Chloe, Julia's younger sister, had remained the constant thread weaving everyone back together. With her quirky humor and new married glow, she became the bridge between old wounds and new beginnings. She visited often, showing up with baked treats and laughter, offering a kind of emotional glue that held the fragile pieces of their family's reunion in place. Julia no longer felt like an outsider. She felt chosen, not out of guilt, but out of growth. And yet, even in the warmth of this new chapter, Julia knew she could not erase the scars left by abandonment. She didn't want to. They were part of her, part of the resilience that taught her how to survive, how to protect her son, how to build a life from scratch. Forgiveness, she realized, didn't always require an apology. It required consistency, not grand gestures, but quiet, steady presence. Not promises, but follow-through. That Christmas Eve, as snow blanketed their little home, Julia prepared dinner for the first full family gathering since Caleb's birth. The table was crowded with dishes made from both old recipes and new traditions. Caleb wore a red sweater his grandmother had knitted, beaming with pride as he told his grandfather about his latest painting, a lion with angel wings, he declared. Laughter filled the room, no tension, no buried grudges, just warmth, however tentative. As they stepped outside to watch the snow fall, Caleb turned to Julia and asked if they could always have dinners like this. She knelt, pulled him into her arms, and whispered, "Me too, baby." The moment was simple, yet profound, a child's wish for love and togetherness, a mother's hope that this time, things were different. Julia hadn't needed an apology to heal. What she needed was proof. And now, as her family slowly learned to love with action instead of appearances, she allowed herself to believe in something she once thought impossible, the chance to belong again, not in the home she was forced to leave, but in the one she had created through strength, grace, and unconditional love. Healing, connection, and the first hints of peace. Her father Richard, once the stern gallery owner who disowned her at 18, had started showing up to her weekend art classes. At first, he sat quietly in the back, helping mix colors or wipe down tables after the kids left. But as the weeks passed, he began engaging with the students, sharing tips on shadowing and brush technique. They called him Mr. Richard the Color Wizard, and Caleb proudly told his friends, "That's my grandpa." It wasn't just his presence, it was his transformation. Richard no longer spoke about legacy or reputation. He simply listened. When Julia mentioned needing new brushes, he donated a box of fine art supplies without fanfare. When one of the students fell behind, he volunteered to tutor. Through these quiet gestures, he was rebuilding something that words never could. Amelia, Julia's mother, took longer to soften. She still wore pearls to the grocery store and corrected Caleb's grammar like she was hosting a dinner party. But on Wednesday afternoons, she began inviting Caleb to the park with coloring books and slices of apple pie. Once, Julia overheard them making up a story about a magical owl who opened a forest gallery. That night, Caleb ran in breathless, declaring, "Grandma says owls paint with their feathers." Julia didn't interrupt. Shone a quiet afternoon as the snow gently fell on the rooftops of Fairbrook. Julia received a visitor she never expected. Chloe had just finished helping her set up for a small weekend art exhibit at the community center when she leaned in with a whisper. "There's someone here asking for you. Says his name is Daniel." Julia's heart stopped, That name hit like a cold wind through her chest. Daniel, Caleb's father. The same man who had disappeared the night she told him she was pregnant, who vanished without a trace when her world began to collapse. Stepping out into the front lobby, Julia saw him standing by the coat rack, sharply dressed, his hair neatly styled, a magazine in hand. On the cover was a photo from her recent art showcase, Julia and Caleb laughing as they painted under the autumn sun. "You've done well," Daniel said with a soft smile, as if nothing had happened, as if 6 years hadn't passed in silence. Julia remained still, her expression unreadable. He extended the magazine. "I saw this, and I had to come. He's mine, isn't he?" Julia's chest tightened. She thought of all the nights she had stayed up comforting Caleb through fevers, of working double shifts to afford art supplies, of painting late into the night just to keep the lights on. She thought of every birthday, every scrape, every question from Caleb asking why he didn't have a father like the other kids. "You don't get to show up now and expect anything," she replied, voice calm but sharp. "You made your choice." Daniel shifted, clearly uncomfortable. "I was scared. I had just gotten that scholarship to LA. I wasn't ready to be a dad. But I've changed now. I have a good job, a stable life. I want to be part of his." Julia didn't flinch. "Where were you when I had nowhere to go? When I gave birth alone? When our son cried himself to sleep, asking if someone out there loved him like a dad should?" He had no answer. His mouth opened, then shut again. Julia saw it clearly. This wasn't love. This was guilt. Or maybe pride. Or maybe the desire to insert himself now that the hard part was over. "If you don't leave now," she warned, "I'll take legal steps. I've kept records of every message, every absence, every medical form. If you try to interfere in Caleb's life, it'll be in court, and trust me, the judge will hear it all." As Daniel tried to protest, another figure stepped into the room. Richard, Julia's father, stood silently beside her. "That's enough," he said. "You may have abandoned her, but I won't let you try and stake a claim, now that she's done all the hard work." Daniel backed down, visibly shaken. He muttered something under his breath, and walked out into the snow, disappearing like he once had, this time with no promise of return. Julia stood there for a moment, her hands trembling slightly. Richard turned to her. "I had a lawyer draft papers years ago, in case this ever happened. I just never told you, you were already doing so much. But he won't hurt you again. I'll make sure of it." Julia nodded slowly, the weight of 6 years lifting off her shoulders. That evening, as she read Caleb his bedtime story, he looked up and asked, "Was that man someone you used to know?" She stroked his hair gently. "Yes, sweetheart. But he's not important anymore. You Grandma, Grandpa, Aunt Chloe, we're a real family, right?" "Yes," she whispered. "The best kind, one that chooses each other." In that moment Julia knew she had closed a door that needed to stay shut, not in bitterness, but in strength. The past might knock again, but she would never let it steal her peace, her son's safety, or the family they had fought so hard to build. As winter wrapped Fairbrook in a blanket of snow, Julia sat by the window watching Caleb sketch Santa Claus under a Christmas tree, his small hands smudged with red and green crayon. It had been nearly a month since her confrontation with Daniel, and although he had walked away, something deeper had begun to shift in Julia's life, something she hadn't anticipated. For years her world had been defined by survival, raising Caleb alone, building her art class from scratch, and shielding her heart from the wounds of the past. But now, something gentler was unfolding. He simply smiled and let it happen. This version of her mother, playful, warm and unguarded, was something she had never known as a child. It was bittersweet to watch her son receive the tenderness she once craved. But instead of feeling jealous, she felt grateful. Maybe it wasn't too late for any of them. Chloe, now married and full of life, visited every weekend, usually bearing fresh scones and stories from her new job at the Whitmore Gallery. But she never came empty-handed emotionally either. She listened without trying to fix, encouraged without guilt, and never failed to show up. "I was blind for too long," she once admitted. "But I'm awake now, and I'm not going anywhere. The biggest surprise came when the Whitmore Gallery, now under Chloe's direction, invited Julia to curate a children's art exhibit, titled The New Generation. For the first time in her life, Julia walked into the same gallery she had once been exiled from, this time not as a disgraced daughter, but as a respected educator and artist. On opening day, Caleb's painting of a starlit winter forest was displayed front and center, surrounded by other children's works, each framed at eye level. Julia added handwritten notes beneath each one. Mr. Monroe, the local art critic, visited and remarked, "It's not just talent these kids have, it's that someone's finally nurturing it the right way." Richard stood beside Julia, silent but visibly emotional. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. No speech, no apology, just presence. That, Julia realized, was enough. That evening, as the exhibit wound down and light rain tapped against the gallery windows, Julia helped her students pack their supplies. Chloe burst in with a cup of cocoa and a tired smile. "Did you see the reviews online? They love it." Julia nodded, but stayed quiet. Her mind wasn't on critics or fame, it was on Caleb, who sat on the floor sketching the moment in real time. He looked up. "Mom, can we do this every year?" She bent down and kissed his forehead. "Yes, because this is our new tradition." Snow began to fall again, softly and steadily, and for the first time in years, Julia felt whole, not because everything had been fixed, but because she had created something meaningful out of the brokenness, something lasting, something real. The early spring sun filtered through the windows of the Whitmore Gallery, casting warm patterns across the wooden floor. Julia stood by the front window, sipping chamomile tea, watching Caleb arrange colored pencils into a perfect gradient on the table beside her. It had been months since David's unexpected appearance, and his departure just as swiftly, but the ripple effects of that encounter had settled into something far more profound: closure. And with closure came room for something new. Caleb had stopped asking about the man in the black suit. Julia had answered his questions gently, always choosing honesty over fear, and Caleb, ever intuitive, had accepted the truth with the grace only children seemed capable of. "We already have everything we need," he told her one night. His words so simple, yet so affirming, and Julia had believed him. Life in Hilford had found a steady rhythm again. Richard, once an imposing figure from her past, now arrived early every Saturday to help set up the art classroom. He had taken to bringing his old sketchbooks, showing Caleb and the other children how to draw shadows with a single pencil. He rarely spoke of the gallery's past, or the choices that drove Julia away, but he no longer avoided the truth either. One afternoon, after class, he handed Julia a small canvas from his youth, a painting of a girl in a red scarf walking through snow. "It reminded me of you," he said quietly. Julia didn't respond with words. She just held the canvas like it was something sacred. Amelia, still measured and elegant, had softened into her new role as a grandmother. She baked with Caleb on weekends, told him stories of when Mommy was little, and once even offered to organize the classroom's supply closet. A task Julia had always dreaded. It was her way of showing she cared, even if she still couldn't say the words out loud. Then there was Chloe. More than a sister now, she was Julia's co-conspirator in healing. Chloe continued running the gallery with integrity and a spark of creativity their parents had never embraced. It was Chloe who pushed for the second children's exhibit and insisted on framing every piece at eye level for the kids, not the adults. "Let them be seen for once," she had said. And so they were. But Julia's favorite part of the week came on Wednesday evenings, when the gallery was closed, and it was just her, Caleb, and a few students staying late to work on longer projects. The place would glow with soft light, quiet music playing in the background, the scent of paper and paint filling the room. Those hours weren't just about art, they were about belonging. For the first time, Julia didn't feel like she was existing on the outside of her own life. She was right where she was meant to be. One evening, as she was cleaning up, Chloe entered the gallery holding an envelope. "This came in the mail today," she said, handing it to Julia. Inside was a letter from the Vermont Youth Arts Council. They had selected Julia to receive a community grant for her work in advancing emotional development through art. Along with it came an invitation to speak at a regional conference. Julia stared at the letter, stunned. Not for fame, not for approval, but because for the first time, her work was being recognized for what it truly was, meaningful. She sat down, letting the words sink in, then looked across the room at Caleb, who was helping a younger student blend watercolors. He glanced over and gave her a thumbs up, his smile lighting up the space. Julia returned the gesture, her chest swelling with something that wasn't pride, but peace. The wounds of the past hadn't vanished, but they no longer controlled her. Her family, once a source of pain, had slowly become part of her foundation, not perfect, not healed overnight, but learning, step by step, how to be present. That night, as they locked the gallery and stepped into the cool evening air, Julia reached for Caleb's hand. "Mom," he asked, "do you think I'll teach art one day too?" "If you want to," she replied with a smile. "You can do anything." And in that moment, with the wind brushing past and the stars just beginning to appear, Julia realized she wasn't rebuilding what was lost. She was creating something entirely new. Under the soft glow of Christmas lights, strung across her modest living room, Julia sat curled up on the couch, watching Caleb finish his drawing of a snowman under a starlit sky. Outside, the wind rustled bare tree branches, and snow flurries danced past the window, covering Hilford in a hush that only winter could bring. It was a scene of quiet joy, a far cry from the fractured holiday memories that used to haunt her. This Christmas marked the first time since her estrangement from the Whitmore family that the word family felt real again. Not because everything was magically perfect, but because for the first time it was honest. Earlier that day, Richard and Amelia had arrived with a homemade pie, a carefully wrapped present for Caleb, and the kind of nervous energy Julia remembered from her childhood, back when her father still tried to connect, before pride had built a wall between them. He didn't make speeches, or bring up the past. Instead, he helped Caleb assemble a wooden puzzle by the fireplace, and quietly asked questions about his favorite colors to paint with. It was small, but Julia saw it for what it was. Effort finally pointed in the right direction. Amelia, once sharp-tongued and rigid, had changed in quieter ways. She no longer commented on Julia's choices with judgment. Instead, she brought along a scrapbook she had started, a mix of Caleb's school photos and drawings, a few recipes she had taught him, and even a note from Liam's teacher praising his creativity. Julia watched her mother flip through the pages with pride, her fingers tracing Caleb's name in glitter glue. "I never did this for you," Amelia had whispered, eyes glassy. "I didn't know how." Julia didn't reply. She didn't need to. Some things were better left unsaid, especially when they were being slowly rewritten through action. Chloe, ever the bridge between past and present, showed up with mismatched socks, peppermint cocoa, and stories about her chaotic married life. She had become the kind of aunt Caleb adored, silly, warm, and full of little surprises. That evening, she and Julia set the table together, joking like they used to before everything fell apart. Dinner was simple: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, Amelia's pecan pie, and laughter. Real, unforced laughter. Caleb told stories about art class, recited lines from a school play, and even convinced Richard to wear a Santa hat. Julia had once believed she'd never see anything like this, but the cost of standing up for herself had permanently locked her out of family. But now she understood the cost wasn't rejection, it was clarity. And that clarity had given her space to build a family on her own terms. After dinner, they exchanged gifts. Julia had painted a small winter landscape for Richard, his favorite scene from the woods behind the old Whitmore estate. He turned it over in his hands, blinking back emotion. "You remembered. I never forgot," she replied. Later, as they stepped outside to watch the snow fall, Caleb tugged at Julia's coat. "Can we do this every Christmas?" She knelt beside him, kissed his forehead, and said, "As long as we keep choosing each other, yes." Inside, the lights continued to glow. The tree shimmered with handmade ornaments and glitter-covered drawings. And Julia realized that forgiveness had never been about erasing pain. It had always been about what you made with the pieces left behind. She wasn't the same girl who had once walked away from the Whitmore mansion with nothing but a backpack and a trembling heart. She was a mother, a teacher, a woman who had taken heartbreak and turned it into art, into purpose, into a life built on quiet strength. And this time, surrounded by people who had once let her go, Julia wasn't hoping to be seen, she simply was. At its heart, Julia's story is a powerful reminder that healing takes time, and sometimes the path to forgiveness isn't paved with words but with action. It teaches us that even when we're cast aside by the very people who should protect us, we can still rise, stronger, wiser, and more self-assured. Her journey from rejection to quiet redemption highlights the importance of staying true to yourself, standing your ground, and choosing love on your own terms. Most importantly, it shows that family isn't about perfection, it's about presence, growth, and the willingness to start again. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Click the like button to support stories that matter, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss future episodes, and share your feelings in the comments below. What part of Julia's journey spoke to you the most? Let's keep the conversation going. You're not alone.